Hey guys, it's William Haddadine here with Derek Carrillo Maldonado.
And Nate
In
Latka.
our podcast today, we'll talk to you about refugees and who they are and how they impact the world today. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the number of refugees and internally displaced people has reached an all-time high since World War II. In 2014, there were almost 60 million refugees and internally displaced people worldwide.
To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire population of Italy being forced out of their homes.
A refugee is somebody who has been forced to flee their country because of persecution, war, or violence.
To give us a better understanding about refugees and where they're from, we talked to Mrs. Salzman, who teaches a class at Prep about conflicts and refugees. And she has a lot of experience dealing with refugees, and she'll tell us about this in this podcast.
My first encounter with a refugee was when I lived as a child in Raleigh, North Carolina, and my parents were involved through their church, with settling a family from Vietnam. So it was a family of 10 that arrived basically by boat. They were part of the boat people, and they were in a camp in Thailand, and then they were resettled to the United States.
This was her very first encounter with refugees, and she quickly befriended the refugees that came to her hometown, but she didn't really know much about them and why they were there. So this sparked up an interest on refugees, and this encouraged her to use it as her field of study. And then she became a worker at the UN.
I worked for the UN agency that takes care of the world's refugees, the UNHCR. I joined that organization in my early 20s, right after I got my graduate degree. And there I found out a lot about refugees. I was working in the office in Brussels on asylum policy, which is interesting now with all the refugees leaving Syria, especially in other countries, and are trying to get to Europe. That situation was still happening in the 1980s, but not to any degree that it's happening now. But so I learned a lot about how European countries receive refugees and what kind of policies they have in place to do that.
So while Mrs. Salzman was working at the United Nations, she worked for this specific branch called the UNHCR, which stands for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. She was based in Western Europe, such as Brussels and Geneva, Switzerland. She served on the emergency team, which means that she had to go anywhere at any time with as little as 2 or 3 days' notice to go help refugees, and she'd have to live on a packed bag.
One of the places I went was Rwanda, and I went there a year after the genocide happened there, so this was in the fall of 1995. And my job was to help with the repatriation of refugees, but they were too scared to come back at the time. So I did visit a lot of the transit centers that they had in the country. Basically, refugees, when they would come home, they would first go to the transit center, which was like a refugee camp. So they would still live in tents, and you'd try to register them and figure out if they were safe to go back to their home villages or not. They would have to stay there for a while. So I did go to transit camps. I would cross the border into Uganda and Tanzania and get counts about how many people have come across the border. That was the only way that we could do that, was by asking the border officials for figures. But I never actually went to one of their camps, but I had a lot of colleagues who had spent a lot of time in those refugee camps.
Usually when refugees first leave their home country, they don't go straight to a new country like the United States or Turkey. They go to what are called refugee camps, which are basically camps that hold all the refugees waiting to be admitted, or at least have the opportunity to go to a new country. But the problem is that these are not the best places to live. They're very dirty, it's very monotonous, which means it's the same thing all day, every day until you flee. And it's crowded, so imagine the Dodge Expressway at 5:45 p.m., except 24 hours in a limited space with a lot more people involved.
Life in a camp is very difficult. When you first arrive in a refugee camp, you can imagine what has just happened. So the reason why people have left their home is usually very traumatic. Something has happened that's very traumatic. So they've either lost family members, directly, that have been, killed or disappeared. They often, in chaos, in many war situations, they get separated from, children get separated from their parents, if you can imagine how that is. You are in a situation that is very uncertain. And you've had to get to this camp. And as you know about what's happening in Europe now, often that journey is very dangerous. And so when you first arrive in a camp, you've just escaped a very traumatic situation. So that's tough. Living in a camp is very limited, very limited. You have really a very strict routine that becomes just very difficult to deal with. The refugees that I've talked with over time say that one of the hardest things about a refugee camp is the monotony of it, just the monotonous life that they live. So with really no hope and no certainty about their future. So it's just getting up, getting water, making breakfast. If you're up until 8th grade, you go to school. After that, there is no school for most camps. You will go to school for maybe a couple hours. It's probably not all day long. Coming back, helping out. But often, there's not employment opportunities. You can start your own store after a while, but, it's kind of, they're very limited. So the hardest part is the monotony of it, the uncertainty of of your future, and also just the sheer just lack of opportunity. Yeah.
How are refugees accepted for resettlement? What are some of the requirements? I know.
So after being in a camp, and the average time that a refugee stays in a camp is 17 years. That's the average time. So if you can imagine even staying beyond that, 30 years, or some are lucky and don't have to stay in a camp that long. But that is the average time. So eventually, when the UNHCR, that's the UN agency dealing with refugees, decides that they cannot go back home, finally, after so many years, they cannot go back home. And they cannot stay in the camp either. The camp is just no life for anybody, and so they can't settle there locally. Like, for example, if you're in a camp in Thailand, the Thai government will never let those people come into Thailand. Will never let refugees come and establish life there. So that is not a solution. So when it's determined they can't go home, they can't stay in the country where they're at, they have to go to a third country. And that is when UNHCR appeals to governments like the United States, like Australia, Europe, many of the more, I suppose, developed countries to accept refugees. And so they do, and it depends year to year how many are going to be accepted. So usually the United States has about 70,000 that they accept every year, but it never quite reaches that number that actually arrive. This year they have gone up, and they're going to accept 100,000 from this fiscal year, which is October 1st till next year. They're going to accept 100,000 refugees, but it's still a very rigorous selection process. So, for example, the United States, they will decide what countries they want refugees from. And if you're not on that list, then you're not going to come to the United States. But if you are on that list, they go to the camps. They have State Department officials that find people. Often it's a question of just keeping families together. If there's family already in the United States, they try to reunify family that's in the camps, or any number of reasons, but they are selected. Then once they're selected to be on a list, then they have to go through a number of things. So they have to go through medical check. They have to go through, of course, security. Now Department of Homeland Security is also in the refugee camps. They're in the field. They're making sure that the vetting process is very rigorous to make sure that they're not going to be a danger to anybody in the United States. So once they go through all of that, they can be selected to come, and then they are then once they're selected, they are provided transportation and time to get settled in the United States, but they have to pay back their plane tickets. So if you can imagine a family of 6 coming from Asia, that's probably about $12,000 that they're going to have to pay back. They have to pay back the plane tickets, and they only get 3 months of assistance once they're here.
And so what countries or regions are most refugees fleeing from today?
So most refugees are fleeing from definitely Syria, has the largest number of refugees now, and Turkey is the largest receiver of refugees from this crisis. So they're like now number 1 in the world for hosting the number of refugees. So other countries that come to mind, of course, we have South Sudan, which we have a lot of refugees here in Omaha from South Sudan. That country became independent. Now it's a separate country from Sudan, from the Republic of Sudan, but now there's new fighting. So we have accepted quite a few Sudanese, also from Darfur area of Sudan, which are Muslim and Arabic speaking as well. There's a small little country in the east of Africa that is producing a lot of refugees. It's Eritrea. And not many people would know about Eritrea, but it is a very difficult situation for particularly males in that country who are forcibly asked to fight, and if not, they are held in a terrible prison if they don't fight. So there's a lot of people leaving Eritrea. Somalia is also at the top of the list for people fleeing that country and all the violence that they have there. And we know about Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group that is there and creating problems. Colombia also has a high number of internally displaced people, but they're not able to leave because there are not many countries that would accept refugees. So yeah.
So what is the difference between internally displaced people and refugees?
Okay, so yeah, difference between internally displaced and refugees. So the number of both of those, internally displaced and refugees, that UNHCR takes care of is about 60 million right now. And the number of internally displaced is more than the number of refugees. So there are more people, and the difference is that internally displaced are like refugees in the sense that they need protection. Their country is not able to offer them protection because of war, because they are part of a group that the government is persecuting, or there might be another group that is persecuting them, but they are unable to receive protection from their government. So they are inside their country, which is harder than being outside your country if it's, sometimes the government that is the one that's persecuting you. So they're unable to leave, but they're not at home either. So they are probably the most vulnerable of the whole refugee population because they are often very difficult to help. It's very difficult also to count the number of internally displaced. It's hard to know how many there are because governments don't, in these countries don't provide very good figures, and they're often not wanting to do that. So they're hard to find, they're hard to help, and the number of internally displaced exceeds the number of people outside of their country needing protection. Yeah.
And you mentioned Omaha with a huge Sudanese refugee population. So when did that start to develop?
The Sudanese here?
Yeah.
So the Sudanese, the number of arrivals from Sudan really started like in the early 2000s. So they started to arrive a lot in 2002, 2003, 2004. And at one point, it was estimated that we had about 20,000 Sudanese from South Sudan. So they're mainly Christian, and they're mainly speaking either Nuer or Dinka, and sometimes Arabic, but it's not their first language. But they, basically Omaha was thought to have the second largest Sudanese population outside of Sudan at the time. And a lot of that was not refugees arriving first in Omaha, but they would arrive, for example, to Detroit, and then they would have family in Omaha, because there was this community that was growing, Sudanese community that was very supportive among, for each other. So they would arrive in Detroit, and then they would come to Omaha because they knew about the jobs also that were available, but also support systems that were here. So yeah, that was the number one, and still is, the highest number of refugees come from South Sudan.
And you mentioned jobs that they have, but what kind of jobs do most refugees end up once they're resettled?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the kind of jobs that they have when they get here, you just basically the refugees that we've gotten in recent decades are people who generally don't speak English when they get here, so they haven't learned English before. So that causes problems in getting like a professional or semi-professional job here. And the sad thing about it is that you have people arriving here who are doctors, who are lawyers, who are nurses, who are teachers, and none of that is recognized here. So if they were a doctor in South Sudan, like in a hospital, they would have to go through medical training here before they would ever get a license to practice here. And the same goes with most professions. So it's very difficult. And if you don't speak English, that's even tougher. So most refugees get very labor-intensive jobs to start with. And they're very, most are extremely productive. They get a full-time job working usually like at a meatpacking plant, or something like that. They take English classes. They take regular college classes as well. They're very, very busy. And if you don't see a lot of these refugees that I'm talking about on the street, it's because they are always busy. They are always going somewhere, and yeah, taking advantage of the opportunities that they never had.
What kind of institutions are in place to help them, like ELL or other things like that, and like any that need change in your opinion?
Okay, so yeah, the institutions here in Omaha, so different agencies are responsible for each city for resettling these refugees. So in Omaha, it's Lutheran Family Services that is responsible for resettling refugees. So in Lincoln, it's Catholic Charities. So it depends where you are as to which agency is basically contracted by the government. The federal government gives them all, a lot of resources to resettle refugees. So Lutheran Family Services are the ones that set up the housing, and they set up people to greet them at the airport, and they orient them to life here, and they start to help them with jobs and opening bank accounts and enrolling kids in school and giving the kids vaccinations and all of this stuff. They're the ones that do that when they first get here. Problems with the system, I see a lot. They only get assistance for 3 months, and unless they have a mentor that is just sticking with that family, they are on their own, literally. And it's not so much when they first get here that there are problems, but it's basically within the first year or in the first 2 years that they start to have, real problems. And there's nobody really available, to help. So I do see that as a problem, the long-term help. The other thing is that OPS, Omaha Public Schools, has been huge in helping with the children, and you can imagine the number of ELL students that they have now. It has gone up exponentially because of the number of refugees that we have here, and because the refugee populations don't learn English. I mean, they haven't learned English where they are, so they need to learn from scratch. So ELL has been very, very helpful, and kids anyway learn a lot faster. And so it usually is a situation that the kids are in school, they learn English pretty fast, and then they serve as, interpreters for their parents, and they basically are learning more of the culture being in school every day too. So OPS, and there are other nonprofit groups. Creighton Prep would be one of them too. We have settled 7 families already, and mentored 3 of them for long term, and so it's huge, and they are always looking for churches or other schools to help resettle refugees. One thing I should mention here is that Omaha last year we settled about 150 families, and of that only 33, 34 were sponsored. That's it. So we have a lot of goodwill in this town, but often it's not making the connection between people who want to help and people who need help. And if that connection can be made, that would really, really help a lot of these refugees that are arriving here. not just in financial terms, because we buy everything for their house to start off with, so they don't have to write checks when they first get here, which from their limited amount of money that they're given by the government, they get all of their furniture and everything in their house already. But it's also just following up, being an advocate for them, talking on the phone with them, filling out applications for them. There's always that need, and the fact that only about a fifth are helped is really small number. Yeah.
And are the numbers of refugees, would you say they're increasing? Like the numbers
Yes.
that need help?
In Omaha or globally?
Both.
Okay, well, definitely the number of refugees, unfortunately, is going up. Okay, so in the past decade, every year they have gone up. So now it's like 58 million refugees, in the world, and that's up from like 49 from last year. So it's not getting better, and unfortunately, the war situations in these countries, the conflicts in these countries where they're coming from, are not resolving. And so that's why you have the same caseload of refugees as the previous year, but then you still have more people leaving. There are not many people going back. There are not many people who are able to repatriate to their countries. And so that's a problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem. And you look at things like climate change and global warming, and people in coastal areas needing to leave their homes in very populated areas. That's going to be a whole other reality. So refugees are around, and they're going to be around for a long time, and how we take care of them is going to determine a lot for how this world is basically peaceful or not.
And what international agencies are in place to aid refugees in their struggles?
So the international agencies that are around, basically the number one is the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they're given money from governments and private individuals to help. They're responsible for all these refugees, but in addition, you have a lot of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that help out. Some of interest to us are like the Jesuit Refugee Service, which is only like around for maybe 20 years, but they are hugely now set up in the world to help refugees. Another one like International Red Cross, you think about Save the Children, World Vision. I mean, there are NGOs that are have been around for many years, and it depends what camp you go to and what refugee situation you're in as to which NGOs are working there. But the more you work with refugees, the more you know these NGOs. Yeah, and also I should mention Doctors Without Borders are very Médecins Sans Frontières that are very big in helping refugees. Yeah.
And what are some things that we can do as high school seniors or college students what are some things that we could do to help refugees with these aid?
Yeah, so definitely some of the things that you can do to help refugees. So I always say, kind of like act local, think globally, but act locally. Because you as a high school student here at Creighton Prep, there's not much you can do globally. I mean, you can write your congressman about allowing more people to come in for resettlement. I think that would be a good thing. But what can you do? I would say focus on things locally. You can definitely become a mentor. I mean, even at your age, you have to do a background check. There are various processes that you can do, but you can be a friend to a family that's here. It basically just involves going by once a week. You don't have to drive them around everywhere. You want them to be self-sufficient, but it's basically going to their house and checking up on how they're doing. And you can if you want to be a mentor, you can pick what family you would like, where they're from. We are going to start seeing some Syrian refugees here. We will start seeing Syrians here. Omaha's been identified as a reception place for Syrian refugees. So yeah, you can be a friend to a refugee. You can help tutor at any of the the schools around that have ELL programs. They have Saturday programs where you go and you help them with English. Of course, there are donations. You can have a mission collection or a collection for a school or fundraiser. You can organize a fundraiser. There's always funds that are desperately needed to help refugee populations here. And you can help dispel some of the myths that some people have about refugees. You know, the fact that Syrians are going to be terrorists that are going to come here and hurt us, you know, that is just simply not true. The people who left Syria left because they don't want to participate in that, and they are fleeing often from that kind of violence. Plus, I talked about the vetting process that goes through before you can ever get here. You have to be completely your whole life exposed. No, and what better way to help peaceful between us and like a country like Syria is to introduce Syrians to our way of life so that they can, you know, like United States and love United States, and then go back and share that. So yeah, anyway, go on about that.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, that's all the question we have. Thank you for letting us interview you.
You're welcome.